both our panelists and the filmmakers are Africana and/or Cornell alumni, and it's just to give an example of the ways in which contact with some of the scholarship that's going on here has been important for a long time, and this is something that we want our students to know as well. I mean, the value of this is obviously to invite them here, to celebrate their achievements, but the other part of it too is when we have our undergraduates saying, well, what do you do with this major or that major, Africana Studies major? Did they know at the same time? So in other words, their path to where they are today is important, and I think it's obviously great that we can do this, have this kind of forum, looking at the film and just giving them sort of evidence of what they've been doing sort of professionally, and look forward to that conversation very much. Leah Mahan is an award-winning filmmaker with an extensive background in documentary filmmaking, new media, outreach, and engagement, and whose work has screened at festivals and been aired on television around the world. She did her undergraduate work in our anthropology department, but she also took courses here at Africana. Among her awards are those that she received from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Directors Guild of America as a nominee for Outstanding Directorial Achievement. Her films include Holding Ground, The Rebirth of Dudley Street, which is from 1996. It's focusing on a grassroots struggle to revitalize a devastated community in the Boston area. She also did a follow-up to that, which came out in 2013, similarly titled, but this had Gaining Ground, not Holding Ground. The second one was Gaining Ground, Building Community on Dudley Street. And last but not least, we have Come Hell or High Water, which came out in 2013. It has aired on PBS and won the Green Tenacity Award at the San Francisco Green Film Festival 2014. And even before that, and this is important too, given its focus, it also won the Audience Award at the New Orleans Film Festival in 2013. So without further ado, we'll look at the film, then the video, then we'll have our panelists come up and speak, and I want to welcome you all here today. Thank you. Introduce our panelists who are here with us this afternoon. First of all, Leslie Fields. Based in Washington, D.C., Leslie Fields directs the Environmental Justice and Community Partnerships Initiative at the Sierra Club. In this capacity, she brings over 20 years of federal, state, local, and international justice and environmental law and policy experience to that organization. She also serves on the board of the Children's Environmental Health Network, as well as on the board of ADISO African Solutions, formerly Horn Relief, an East African Natural Resources and Development Organization. Leslie Fields is also an adjunct law professor at Howard University School of Law. She's a graduate of Cornell University and the Georgetown University Law Center. Kenneth Robinson, Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Clemson University, South Carolina. His research and publications focus on areas such as food systems, entrepreneurship and small business development, enterprise zones, sustainable community development, and health disparities, particularly in rural areas like South Carolina, the US South, and South Africa. He is the elected chair of the Southern Rural Sociological Association and has been a reviewer for the US Department of Agriculture and for several associations in his professional field. He received his doctorate from our Development Sociology Department. Welcome to you both. Our alumni, and I also just would like them to perhaps begin by saying what they think these, the documentary as well as the piece that we just saw from YouTube, what are they communicating? What do they need to communicate to everyone? Now these should be on, we just have to, yeah, you got them? Oh, sorry.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. And it's just it's a blessing to be back here at the Africana Center. And I want to thank so much Professor Ching and staff here, and my good old friend, Ken Robinson. And I also want to acknowledge two other friends who are here, Dean Gretchen Ritter and also Professor Gerald Torres from the law school, also good friends. And so it's great to be here. And it's, so much of what I know about my political economy, my understanding critical thinking was actually formed here, right here in the Africana Center. And I had amazing professors, Professor Turner, Professor Manning Marable, Congressman Bata, and others. And so we are commemorating, as you all know, the 10th anniversary of Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, which there have been other hurricanes since. There was Gustav, there was Ike, which devastated Galveston. We had Superstorm Sandy. I'm sure Professor Robinson will talk about how he had what's going on in the flooding in South Carolina. And all of these things are happening because we've had, in our country, in terms regarding environmental justice, there has been a bit of environmental justice movement created due to the legacy of exploitation, stealing and exploiting lands from tribal communities, due to slavery, due to segregation, due to discriminatory land use policy, and now redlining. And so what we're seeing is the results of these practices all over the country. There are turkey creeks everywhere. They're all over the world. And it's a blessing to do this work. The environmental justice movement didn't always exist. When I got out of law school, it didn't exist. We've been making it up. We've been making a way when there's been no way. And the activists, the community people, other people, academicians, all kinds of people from all walks of life have created the environmental justice movement. It's the vanguard of the environmental movement, in my opinion. And we are now responding to the climate crisis, which is a crisis that affects all of us now. And so it's been 10 years. I've spent a lot of time in the Gulf. I have to say, in terms of Turkey Creek, they're still under threat, unfortunately. The son of the developer, Butch Ward, wants to fill in 432 more acres. They won't stop. So we are in a pitched battle right now. We have commented against their permit application. It was very flawed. And we've been working with the Mississippi Center for Justice and some of the other groups, as you saw in the film. Basically, we got the band back together, and we're fighting that permit. And we hopefully will be able to stamp this out, and that the Ward family will, finally get the message, and hopefully the Army Corps of Engineers will buy that property along with the state of Mississippi, and so we can keep that greenway and keep those wetlands so that community isn't threatened for flooding. And Rose Johnson, who she won the Sierra Club Bullard Award last year, she has started the North Gulfport Land Trust, and so they're in the process too of raising money and buying more land. And so the community has really come together, but they have suffered so much under segregation, and they are really, there's so many things that still need to happen with them. They're facing voter suppression, they're facing issues with their schools, they're facing all these other things that are going on in these communities, mass incarceration. So there's a lot going on there. So we call that, in the environmental law, you have a right to permit, you have a right to pollute. I mean, you get a permit, there's the four corners of the permit under the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, and you're allowed to pollute so much. So what we're trying to do is make sure that there's an EJ analysis, there's an environmental justice analysis to whether it's a permit, whether it's a rule, so we can get the best data and look at what we call cumulative impacts, which is not just within the four corners of a permit, but is also the truck traffic, the mobile traffic, the fact that these communities don't have insurance, the fact that these communities don't have a hospital, the fact that there's food apartheid. I don't like the term food desert. Desert implies some naturally occurring condition, okay? I'm very proud of the work we've been helping with in the lower Ninth Ward. They still don't have a grocery store. Okay, after 10 years, they still don't have a grocery store. That's not a desert. That is apartheid. They did not want those people coming back. So the actor Wendell Pierce, who many of you may know from The Wire, he was Bunk, and then he was in Treme. He tried to cut a deal to get a grocery store, to change stores, and that still fell through because of the redlining. The insurance is 3 or 4 times more than it used to be. There's less housing. There's what really also was destroyed, we were talking about earlier, even if you worked in the service industry, even if you worked in the hotels or casinos, you had those kinship networks. So, you know, you had your grandmama or your Auntie Mamie that watched your kids. Well, now grandmama has passed on and Auntie Mamie stayed in Memphis. So everything has gotten more expensive and harder. And so it's still, we end the documentary video saying there's still more to do because there's a lot to do. And so, but it's been, and there's also the other issues with the development in New Orleans. And frankly, the black middle class has been eviscerated. It was the shock doctrine. All the teachers were fired. That was the backbone of the black middle class. That was the Black Women's Union. And then Charity Hospital still has not been reopened. One of the first hospitals to have admitting privileges for black doctors. So the doctors, the nurses, technicians, that has not been opened either. That's another institution of the black middle class that has not recovered. So the LSU is now a hospital complex down on Canal Street, if you've been down there, and they're starting to hire people again. Is there anybody here from the Gulf? Anybody here who grew up in the Gulf, from the Gulf? So, thank you. So, you know, it's a long way from the Gulf to Ithaca, New York, right? And, so it's still in recovery, and there's still the other storms. So we're very concerned, and that's why we're working very hard to try to restore these wetlands that have been cut up by the oil and gas industry. The BP oil disaster, the settlement, there's another settlement that Department of Justice has. Many of you may have read already that there's that settlement. And basically, it sounds like a lot of money, but under the Oil Pollution Act, you're supposed to get maybe over $100 or so per barrel that's been spilled. It's coming out to about $20 or so per barrel that's been spilled. But it looks like it's still a lot of money, but it's not where it should be. So there's still a lot of threats, but this is going on due to our consumption and our extractive lifestyle. And I think that the skills that I got here in the Africana Center and at Cornell have really borne out, and I'm just very pleased to be able to be part of this movement, and also encourage anyone can be part of this movement. You can be a student, you can be a professor, you can be a grandmama, you can be an artist, you can be a teacher. And in some way, to be a part of this, it's taken me all over the world, and our environment affects everyone, and our kids depend on us being engaged on some level. And so I'll stop there, but I'm so appreciative of being here, and to thank you all for having us, and put this over to my friend Ken.
Great. Well, thank you. Like Leslie, I am very happy to be back on the Cornell campus. We were just saying earlier, I lived in Ithaca for 11 years, and so it was quite a large amount of time spent here. But I think one of the things that I took away from my experiences, I graduated, as was said earlier, in development sociology, but spent a quite bit of time at Africana during my years. And the thing I think I took away from Africana was sort of that activism of the students and of the school. And I think I've taken that with me to Clemson and have been supportive and working with students there to become much more involved in communities outside of campus. And so those are some of the things that we are doing there. Thanks a lot to Africana for the hospitality and the invitation. I see my dissertation professor sitting in the back. He raised his hand when we mentioned New Orleans and the Gulf Coast, Ralph Christie, Applied Economics, and the Cornell International Institute for Food and Agriculture Development. And it was through those experiences here at Cornell that, with a background and interest in development, specifically community and economic development, that is what brought me to this environment. I'm a newcomer as compared to Leslie to environmental justice, but have been interested in communities for quite some time. And at Clemson, with an emphasis on student engagement and service learning, I have endeavored to get students into communities. And South Carolina, there are a couple of EPA designated environmental justice communities that I have gotten my students into, and through my human ecology social impact analysis course, we are very interested in looking at the social consequences of development and some of the changes that are taking place in these communities. So in South Carolina, there are a number of disadvantaged, economically disadvantaged and low income communities, including my hometown, which were traditionally textile mill towns. So the textile industry moved offshore beginning in the 80s and 90s. Well, my hometown, textile was sort of continuing on the decline, but until 2005, there was a train derailment with the railroad tracks that come through town. There was a train derailment. This community, by the way, population of about 2,500 people. And so when the train derailed, the company saw it as a convenient opportunity to really shut down the place. No need to reinvest in this place. Most of the operations had moved offshore at that point. So the company was closed, essentially. And in turn, the folks there who had grown up in that area looking forward to jobs in the textile mill could no longer do that. So many of them had to be retrained, reskilled, or moved to service sector jobs, which paid much less. And so the areas, my hometown, was essentially abandoned. It was just a one industry town, this textile mill, which the town was formed because of the textile mill. So what complicates the situation in my hometown is it's unincorporated. There's not a town council. There's not a mayor. So when the train derailment came, Norfolk Southern was the railway that had the crash. They paid out a bunch of money. Well, unlike maybe Turkey Creek and other places, there was a depository they could send those monies to. Well, in my hometown, there wasn't one. So they sent it to the county. Everyone had something that would benefit Graniteville if these monies came to that. Well, the monies came to the county, and they got dispersed, and the folks there were like, well, what happened? We were at the brunt of this, you know, and so, but believe it or not, realizing there were a couple of referendums afterwards to incorporate, saying that if something were to happen like this again, or in the future, we could do better planning if we incorporate it. Well, each time the referendum came up, there was this complaint about raising taxes and the cost that it would, so still today, there's no incorporation in this small town. The place looks abandoned, and the mill properties are overgrown. So those are the kinds of things. So not only in my hometown, there are other towns spotted around South Carolina that have abandoned mill properties. These mill properties are designated as brownfield sites, and they lack development now because a developer will not come in because they aren't sure about the environmental contamination that's taking place there. So these places are at a standstill, but with the support of the Sierra Club in South Carolina, the Department of Health and Environmental Control, and US EPA Region 4, they are beginning to bring many of these communities together, and they are able to see that it's not just us, but we're in this, there are other communities dealing with these same issues. So we're hopeful that through that and activism on the part of these communities to demand and to insist upon changes being made that will support the communities and not simply the developers and the folks who are speculating on their development.
Now, I'm just going to have one sort of question and so on, and then open it up because I know people want to ask questions and have comments as well. You know, what has struck me about looking at the film, but also to what you're saying, is that even any volunteer who would want to come to you in EJ, now I know that people say EJ, not environmental justice, in EJ, in the EJ movement have to work with two things, which is to create solidarity in the community when it's not been there, and then be so vigilant about, you know, when things are going to happen, who is working towards development. I mean, I'm looking at Derek, and he's just like, surrounded by, sort of initiatives for development constantly, and then they happen upon things that people do sneakily and stuff like that. So how is that manageable? It's not manageable, right? But do you have anything to say about that? I mean,
Well, it is really hard. And Derek's doing fine. He lives in Roxbury, and I just saw him last month. He's renting out his properties, and we had a long discussion about whether he was going to take the Katrina Rita trailer back down for the 10th commemoration. And it got really beat up because they got so much snow in Boston last winter. So he decided not to do it and to focus on himself. And there was a big summit that NAACP did in Gulfport. I was down for that. And then we went over to New Orleans and did all the activities around there. It is really, really hard. I mean, the main reason is because of resources. I mean, there's just the funding disparities for this work. We're talking about taking on race and corporate power. No one funds the revolution, okay? There's no funding for it. And we are looking at different models in terms of membership development and that sort of thing. So we're in a big issue right now with funders who fund the mainstream environmental groups as opposed to funding the EJ and community groups. And I'm in the middle of that, and we're trying to get the major funders to do more with and fund these EJ and community groups directly. I'm always asked to re-grant, and I'm not trying to do that. And first off, I don't want to be picking eeny, meeny, miny, mo, okay? But second, the funders need to develop these relationships with the community EJ groups and vice versa. And so we did that filing with this big grant very recently, and I'm really happy about that. But that's been a real problem because the funding they get is, it's colored people money. I mean, it's pitiful. They expect you to save the world for $40,000 for 2 years, and that's what we're talking about. So, and we also, in terms of volunteers, basically, when we enter a community, we have a set of protocols based on the 1991 People of Color Leadership Summit, 17 Principles of Environmental Justice, and the community speak for themselves. So we really try to make sure that we are there to on tap but not on top. And so that's very, very important. I'm very big on MOUs, Memorandum of Understandings, and have this all written down so we understand if we're going to have, we're in a campaign or we're in a fight, who's going to do what, especially around the press. And we have, it's all trial. We've made a lot of mistakes, but at least we try to own up to our mistakes. So, but with volunteers, basically I've always said, if your liberation is not tied up with this community's liberation, okay, then, you need to think really hard why you're doing this, all right? Because your liberation has to be tied in with this community's liberation. And you saw that, Katrina is a really good example of that. They put all the dumps, they put the landfills in the black community, they put the pesticide blending plant behind Xavier University in HBCU. They put another huge dump over in the Vietnamese community where we also work. But guess what? It all got flooded and all the contamination got everywhere. Okay? So the folks in the Garden District and French Quarter, all the nice places you go to, when you go to New Orleans. Now, it's all toxic. That's what happens. Same thing with climate disruption. So that's, but it's hard because of the disparity of resources and then the overwhelming power of the other side, and we are doing a lot of rulemaking, and the other side through the Chamber of Commerce or the Black Chamber of Commerce, comes out, and we're in this pitch battle right now on one rule, and the Black Chamber of Commerce has said, it's called the Clean Power Plan. They said the Clean Power Plan is the new Jim Crow, okay? And we're never that pithy to respond, all right? We are very wonky, and we have to get better about how we respond. They're very good on the other side of coming out with this stuff. So that's challenging.
I would just simply add, I think Turkey Creek had two things going for it. One, Derek Evans. In many of the communities where we do work, there's this tremendous brain drain from those communities. So especially young people like Derek aren't necessarily returning to those places. So oftentimes the folks who are left there don't necessarily have the means, the energy, and the know-how to be able to understand the regulations, to deal with the powers speak truth to power in those instances. So I think it's very important to, and we're trying to do this at Clemson in terms of getting students back into those communities to provide some of that. The second piece there I think we saw was sort of the bridging social capital that was taking place there. So beyond just what was local in the community, but being able to reach to other aspects. So the work with the environmentalists, they were reaching to those different communities. In many of our communities, there are strong bonding social capital, meaning that there are folks who know each other. They've been in these communities, they've worked in their communities, in their neighborhoods for a long time. But oftentimes, between communities, there has not been a lot of bridging. So there are a lot of factions and internal divisions, perhaps in those areas, through legacies of social exclusion. So especially when we're talking down south, there's been lots of social exclusion in many of these communities. And so it's bridging, being able to bridge over and network over to those other communities and bring those communities together, especially when they see things in common where they can work and join forces to address those things. So I think that was one of the things that helped a lot in the Turkey Creek situation.
Let's open up. Grace, would you be able to take this around? Thank you, Grace. We'll be taking around the microphone. Yes, for questions.
Hi, thank you both so much. I'm Judy Byfield. I'm in the history department, and I teach African and Caribbean history. And so in watching this too, you know, it's such an international story at the same time. And when you think about the oil companies and what they're doing in the Gulf is very similar to what they're doing in the Niger Delta in Nigeria as well. So I really just want to commend you for continuing to do this work. And also to ask about some of those international relationships. I know that in South Africa in particular, there's been quite a lot of work done around environmental justice, and they actually credit the American activists with sort of bringing that to South Africa, although they also say that they have radicalized it in ways that it hasn't been radicalized here.
Well, absolutely, it's an international movement. I did work in Nigeria for 2 years on the West African gas pipeline, and I've written about how there's no difference between the Niger Delta and the Louisiana Delta. It's the same companies bedeviling the same people. It's Shell, it's BP, obviously, it's Egypt, and these other companies. It's a matter of regulation. And so, in the Nigerian constitution, there's a right to life, but the companies get environmental variances, so that's where the corruption comes in. Right, and so, but there are awash in oil there, but the refineries are offline. You have to actually import their gas. So, and then in South Africa, very similar, we were at the World Conference Against Racism and Related Tolerances in 2001, we were all in Durban, and really that's really where much of the collaboration started, and with the EJ movement there and in the US. You have the same issue going on. We've got water shutoffs going on in Detroit and Baltimore as we speak. I was in Detroit this past weekend. People are getting their water shut off because they can't pay the bills. There are children languishing in foster care because their parents cannot pay their water bills. Okay? I mean, it's horrifying. And same thing in KwaZulu-Natal. When Bechtel came in and privatized the water, there was a cholera epidemic because people couldn't afford the water rates, so they started going back into the creeks and the streams to get their water, and about 1,000 people died of cholera. So this corporatization of our commodities, our water, there's a right, it's a human right. I mean, we're talking about violations of human rights. And so it is very international. Many of us are going to Paris in December for the climate meeting. And what's encouraging is that there's so many young people now so interested in this, very much interested in it, very engaged, teaching us what we need to do, and it's great. So I'm very hopeful that we're going to get some agreements, that we're going to get some funding into the climate fund for developing countries to really deal with the adaptation and mitigation problems that they're having, like Bangladesh and all these low-lying countries, and also development assistance, because we're the ones causing the problem. We're the 5% of the population using 30% of the resources. So It's just been, and the solutions come from these communities all over the world. And we have to make sure that, and it's so much, because of the internet and it's, all these techniques and ways to communicate with each other, that we're really learning from each other, and that's really been great.
My work has primarily been domestic in nature, but I think there are a lot of lessons that can be learned internationally, and so in my classes I try to introduce my students to those cases, and also we talk about the ecological footprint, and we see that that's globalization and those activities, so we're all impacted as a result of that.
Great question.
More questions?
Ralph Christie, the Dyson School in CFAD. I want to commend you both. I think you're doing very good work. The work that you're doing in New Orleans is actually my home. Born there, never really lived there, but my parents and grandparents and cousins by the dozens are there, and some are still scattered and struggling to get back. Question, I'm a development economist, and in our conversation these days, there's a lot of conversation about resilience, building resilient communities, and how do you go about building resilience. On the other hand, there's this whole discussion about inclusion, and how do you make people included into economic growth and our opportunities. If these were competing models, which do you think would be more useful for the communities that you work with?
So Ralph is not really saying, but I know he's targeting that question because he and I always had this debate. Now, he was the economist and I'm a sociologist, and so he was on my dissertation committee, and so we had these conversations. Well, I think part of this notion of community development is investment in the resources in the community. And so part of that is being able to, this idea of bridging these divides. And I think it's important to have a more informed citizenry, and having, as part of that inclusion, being in the decision-making, being there at the table. So including those folks as we do our research, having them to be stakeholders in the process, to be contributors, and not necessarily just people who are being acted upon with the decisions being made by experts or the moneyed people, essentially, but being part of the decision-making process and including them in those decisions, how they're going to be affected by the decisions that are being made.
No, that's right. I mean, the other thing is that the greenies, the environmentalists, have not been that easy. So it has been also a movement to make them more inclusive and to make them think differently about what inclusivity is, what diversity is, and Gerald's smiling at me, he knows. And so the it really has been a process, and we are constantly battling EPA and the other agencies about their use of the Administrative Procedures Act. What does notice and comment really mean? What is meaningful involvement? What does that mean? And it's shocking that we still have to have these conversations. We'll have events, and there still won't be translators. They'll have events, in the middle of the day. They'll have events, where people just don't have the access and they call it a day. Or where they publish they publish the permit. There's a hearing for a permit in that little teeny part in the back of the paper. I'm hard pressed to read it. Only in English, never in the local minority paper, people of color paper, or local paper. Never in Vietnamese, never in Spanish or anything. Never in Navajo. All the things that's going on in tribal lands, Navajo Nation with uranium mining, they still don't publish things in Navajo. So it's still a real big struggle. It's still challenging, and they don't, the other side, the industry, the trade associations, they have a right. They are talking to the permit rule writers all day, every day. So what we've been doing is, with EPA, is making sure that there are also workshops for community folks, faith groups, other interested people, to also talk to the rule writers and to have that access as well. And so that's a big part of this new rule called the Clean Power Plan, That we have to define what meaningful involvement means, and in a way that is meaningful, as opposed to people struggling with everything else they have to do, and now they have to learn, some engineering term. It's never really a battle of the experts. It's always a battle of the lawyers. It's always a battle of the experts to break this stuff down, to explain what this means, and then use everything in the toolbox: the antiquities laws, the environmental laws, civil rights laws. We are still struggling with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. It's not been enforced at EPA, and we've used it in the permit context. Title VI, any recipient of federal funding cannot discriminate on the basis of race, natural origin, or color. So what we used to do was we would file a Title VI complaint to the permitting agency to slow down that permit, and it was great, but then we had a terrible Supreme Court decision which eviscerated the private right of action, but we still can file administrative complaints. And you don't have to be a lawyer to do that, but you have to know that it's available to you. So there's all kinds of ways, and it's just, my dream would be if we could have some great big clearinghouse in the sky, because it does break my heart when I hear all these communities are, just reinventing the wheel over and over again. Because like I said earlier, there are turkey creeks everywhere, all over the world. And they come up with great solutions, and we're now the challenge, and we're now trying to address the legacy issues and move into renewable clean energy for everybody. Not just doctors' offices in Santa Monica, California, but for everybody. And that's what we're trying to do now while we're addressing these legacy issues, because people we have sacrifice zones in this country, like in the rest of the world. Cancer Alley, Beaumont, Port Arthur, Texas, Richmond, California, that corridor down from New York City to to Elizabeth, New Jersey. Those people will never be available to clean energy future if they're a sacrifice zone, and all the unwanted land uses and all the facilities that are being expanded, because they are. The Panama Canal got expanded, so all these port communities now are really getting hit hard. The ports are expanding, the rail lines are expanding, the truck traffic's expanding. With these expansions, many of these facilities get tax abatements. So one reason I think Detroit's in bankruptcy is because all those facilities got tax abatements, and the roads and the bridges and the schools and everything is crumbling. The sewage treatment plant is crumbling, and people next to refinery are getting sewage backed up in their homes because the refinery has not been paying the taxes. And it falls so the homeowners are paying 4 ways. First, you're paying for your health, you're paying for your mental health, you pay taxes, and then you gotta pay for the cleanup.
Thank you. Good afternoon again. It was great talking a little earlier. I wish there were more students here, because this question would be really most beneficial to them. When they articulate this binary juxtaposition of thinking and doing things, as if you're learning to do things, you are an activist, it means that you are not a critically engaged intellectual. So if you could say a little more about how in your own evolution you came to realize that those two things were actually dynamically related and they benefit. The other question is more, there was a movement at some point, maybe a decade or so ago, you'll be in a better position, Professor, to say that many people who migrated to the north from the south here, they were sending their children back home. I wonder how this environmental impact, of course it's everywhere, but there are dimensions that are specific to the south that we're talking about. Has it impacted people? You mentioned brain drain. How has it impacted the human decision, population dynamics, and the impact on communities?
I can start with that. Well, personally, how I have become involved in this is to whom much is given, much is required. So I feel a responsibility to my community, those folks back home in that small town of 2,500 where I grew up. And so I am just doing my part, and I'm trying to work with this millennial generation, students in my classes, to encourage them to use the power that they have. I often tell the students they're in a privileged position to be sitting in those seats at Clemson University. There are other students who would like to be there, but those were the students who were accepted. They're there, and it's a privileged position to be in that space. And as a result of that, I am hopeful that those students will come away with a better understanding of the complex issues that we're confronted with, and realize that we aren't restricted to only the traditional way that things have been done. And I think the suffering, in the sense when folks leave and not necessarily use the information that they have learned and share it with others, especially those coming on behind them. So I think that's the piece, and I do think many of those communities have suffered as a result of some of the decisions that have been made, such that, you know, Derek Evans mentioned, he left Turkey Creek, or, you know, he's not in Turkey Creek because, or his grandparents, they had to leave because the opportunities were not there. So oftentimes that's the situation, because of development choices and decisions that were made, these historical legacies and those kinds of things, opportunities haven't been there, and those places have suffered as a result of that. And I think it's very important, especially personally, to be able to contribute to trying to rectify in what measure I can those situations.
That's a really good question, and I started out just gosh, hard to get involved with this. I had my grandparents. I started out. I'm a cultural environmentalist, like a lot of us are. I was hunting and fishing with my grandparents. They had a huge garden. My grandmother made our clothes, and that, you know, I had an appreciation for nature. And then, you know, when I was living, I grew up around Cleveland, Ohio, and back then, I didn't see the Cuyahoga River burn personally, but we thought, as my brother and I thought as little kids, it was so contaminated and was so full of debris that ducks could walk on the river. We thought that was really funny. And my dad, who worked for Sunoco, said, "Smells like money. This is the normal thing. This is how it's supposed to be." And there was a Sherwin-Williams paint plant which discharged straight into the Cuyahoga, the mouth of the Lake Erie, which I never got to swim in as a kid because it was so polluted. And we would go see, hey, what color is the river? Maybe it's green today and yellow and blue today or blue tomorrow. We thought that was really great, all right? And that's what breaks my heart when I go to around the country and around the world and I see children, you know, like you mentioned, New Nigeria, swimming in oil, and they think that's normal. I mean, that's just, it's heartbreaking to see that. I got involved with farm worker advocacy in law school, and like I said, I thought, you know, I honed my critical thinking skills here at Cornell. I did the Cornell Washington program, and then I moved to Texas, and I'd always been involved with, you know, I liked the toxic stuff, but I was a volunteer with this NAACP, and the state conference president there, who's still the state conference president, he used to send us out. We were like the shock troop. And there was a problem, someone would call, he'd set us out. And our Desert Branch president, Gretchen remembers this, said there was Gary told us there's some toxic thing, our Desert Branch president called, and I put the map on the dashboard and I drove like 7 hours, and I tell this to young people now, before there was GPS, right? And got there, this place, and there was a little school of Black and Latino kids next to a synthetic rubber plant, the Dynagen. And there was the highway, and there were tractor-trailer trucks coming out. And I get out of my car, and I'm coughing and gagging, and I'm like, who does this? I mean, I was just like, what is this? And I go to the meeting, and the abuelas and the grandmamas, and they're looking at me like, what are you gonna do? And I have like no idea. So I go back to Austin, where I was living, go to the great University of Texas Law Library, and I'm looking through the Texas Clean Air Act, and I don't see anything about this. And then I start trying to pick through the federal Clean Air Act, which is impossible. And that's when I realized there isn't anything on this. And that's kind of where I had my epiphany and started driving all over Region 6 EPA, Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, New Mexico, finding where these things were on my own time, and just trying to build up the expertise. And one thing led to another. It's a long story. But I say this just to say that volunteers are very, very important. And it changed my life, basically. And then I started going to Mexico and Central America, and same issues. And so it's just been, you know, I've had the ability to do that and the resources to do that, and people who supported me. And then I had other jobs, and I had my own little, I was doing a lot of other things, but then I made up this job at the Sierra Club, and they already had organizers in different cities based on communities who wanted organizers. We were also in Detroit, Indianapolis, Puerto Rico, on the Navajo Nation, we're in Appalachia, on mountaintop removal mining. We are, I mentioned New Orleans. We are also in DC, and we are also in Memphis. So and work with the larger environmental communities and justice communities. So there's no shortage of issues, but there's a lot of great coalitions. There's a lot of great work. Faith community. So many other constituencies have really gotten involved. I am now out as a Catholic. Okay, I was a closet Catholic for a very long time. Now we had Pope Week, you know. So the encyclical was. I encourage everyone to read it. It's a beautiful document. It's really short little chapters. I wrote a blog on it if you want the Cliff Notes version. So it's just been growing and growing and growing, and we, like I said, really working hard to try to, you know, this clean energy space now. Don't want anybody excluded from it, like people who have been excluded in other things, you know, and want to make sure that these so-called sacrifice zones are going to be part of that. But they're going to get some electric cars too. They're going to get some bike share, right, and ride share and all that stuff. So, and they will get, you know, not just have to have bodegas to eat out of and you know, get what they deserve because they're taxpayers and they deserve these services and everything.
We'll take another question, and then, yes. Siva.
Actually, it's just a point of clarification. I thought I heard something there and in the movie, and I just wanted to know how that relates to how we understand how we are governed or how we govern ourselves. And it had to do with Governor Haley Barbour deciding at some point that the recovery was over and he can take $640 million and do something else with it.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry.
Yeah, and the question actually is about how the federal government works and how it's accountable to citizens, whether after an emergency where the federal government gives money, the governor can make that decision. I mean, I come from Africa, and Turkey, the whole continent is Turkey Hill. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that, but yeah. In terms of how people do stuff, right? And I just really wanted to understand how that is possible in this context of whether federalism allows that, and yeah, it's really
Well,
quite
under the Stafford Act, okay, when there's an emergency declared, okay, when President Obama has declared a state of emergency in South Carolina, under the Stafford Act, the Robert H. Stafford Act, all environmental laws are waived, and all discretion to devote to rehabilitation, recovery, and the funding is at the discretion of the president. He then passes that discretion on to the governor. And that's how, in a part, how Haley Barbour was able to divert the restore money to the casinos and to the Gulf, to the port. Louisiana had 8, there were 8 cycles of emergency orders. And so, and I think Mississippi had about 5. This state of emergency lasted for about 6-7 years. Okay, it just kept asking for emergency designation. So the president's discretion is passed down to the governor. And that's really how that happens. And it's obviously more complicated. But Sierra Club broke open the issue around the formaldehyde off-gassing in the FEMA trailers. And Daryl Malik Wiley, who's in the film, who's in the video, and our great volunteer, Becky Gillette, were hearing stories that people's pets and children were getting sick, and the formaldehyde was off-gassing while people are struggling to rebuild their homes. And so we partnered with the U.S. Wood Products Association. It was a great collaboration, and the Alliance for Healthy Homes, because what was happening was that all those trailers are coming from China, and they were undercutting our U.S. companies. And so it was a long campaign, but we had President Obama sign SB 1660, which is the Wood Products Association Act, so to kind of curtail that and stop FEMA from buying these cheap trailers. Unfortunately, they're all over the place, just like flooded cars are all over the place. So that's an example of building a coalition, private-public partnerships, and also faith community and EJ communities, because that is the stuff that's sent down. There's an emergency order. The Red Cross is engaged. I mean, there's a whole horror story with the Red Cross. When Derek is saying they're over on the other side and they don't have bleach, the Red Cross came down to Gulfport, and that mayor told them that it's too dangerous for you all to go down there. And they did not get any services from the Red Cross. That's why Derek was going down there with bleach. Now, excuse me, the Red Cross goes all over the world. They go to every other conflict zone in the world. And they were told not to go to North Gulfport. And they did not go. And this was going on. So they've had to go through this huge reform process. So, and I just also, so there's also the part of the country we're talking about, and also elsewhere. I mean, there's still a lot of intimidation. There's still the Klan. There's all these people. All right, it's the second guy, I forget his name, not Butch Ward, the other guy, not the mayor, he's in prison. All right, yay, okay, for fraud and I mean, they're just, so the taller man sitting, who's the one who says, we didn't know there was anybody in there, and that the guy can buy other memories, that guy, he's in prison. So, it's really hard because they still have to do other things and get other, the voter suppression, better housing, better schools, all these things are still going on down there too, while they're trying to, preserve this environmental issues.
Well, we'd like to thank our panelists very much. I'd invite you to engage with them afterwards as well. I'm sure they would enjoy that. So thank you very much. Thank you very much.